I didn't think the worst night of my life would start with a rehearsal dinner. My mother-in-law had rented out the private room at Carver's, the kind of restaurant where they fold your napkin into a swan and refill your water before you even notice it's low. 42 people. Candles. A slideshow running on a loop behind the bar. Photos of my fiancé and me from the past 3 years, all of them chosen by her, none of them the ones I would have picked. I was 31. I had spent 4 years building something I thought was real. I found out it wasn't at 8:47 in the evening, between the salad course and the entree, when my fiancé's older brother leaned across the table and slid a folder toward me the way you'd slide a check toward someone you wanted gone. Quietly. Efficiently. Without eye contact. "You should read this before tomorrow," he said. I thought it was a prenuptial addendum. His family's attorney had been circling for weeks, tweaking language, adjusting clauses. I wasn't surprised. I opened the folder. It wasn't a prenup. It was a private investigator's report, 41 pages. My name on the cover. My address, my banking history, my college transcripts, my mother's name, my mother's maiden name, and then on page 7, a section titled Subject's Biological Origins that made the room tilt sideways. I read the first paragraph twice. Then I closed the folder. My fiancé was watching me from across the table. He didn't look surprised. He looked the way people look when they've been waiting for something to land and it finally has. "We thought you should know," his mother said from the head of the table, her voice carrying just enough for the nearest guest to hear. "Before this goes any further." She paused. The room had gone very still. "You're not who you told us you were." I wasn't. But not in the way she meant. I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry or argue or ask for an explanation because something had already shifted inside me. Something cold and clarifying, the way air feels right before a storm breaks. I picked up the folder, slid it into my bag, and said, very calmly, that I needed some air. "If you walk out that door," my fiancé said, "don't come back." I looked at him for a long moment, at the man I'd planned a life around, at the table full of people who had known, apparently for some time, and said nothing. Then I walked out. The valet brought my car around in 4 minutes. I tipped him $20 because someone that night should be treated decently. I drove 6 blocks, pulled into a parking garage, turned off the engine, and sat in the dark reading a private investigator's report about my own life. Page 7 told me my mother had a sister. Page 11 told me that sister had died 14 months ago. Page 33 told me she had left something behind. I had known almost nothing about my mother's family. She didn't talk about them. When I was small, I assumed this was grief. Her parents had died young. She'd told me that much, and I learned early not to press. Later, I assumed it was something more complicated. Old wounds. Family fractures that had calcified into silence. I stopped asking around the time I turned 16, and understood that some doors stay closed, because opening them hurts more than leaving them shut. My mother died when I was 24. A brain aneurysm, fast and without warning. I had 7 minutes with her in the hospital before she was gone, and I spent them holding her hand, not asking questions, because she couldn't answer them anyway. I had no father. I knew. I had no siblings. I had built my adult life out of what I'd made myself. A graduate degree in urban planning, a job I was good at, a relationship I thought was solid. I had convinced myself that family was something you chose, not something you were born into, and for a while that felt true enough. The report said my mother's sister was named Cecily Marquand. She had lived in Vermont, outside a town called Hartwick, on a property that had belonged to their grandfather. She never married. She worked as a land conservationist for 30 years. She died of cancer at 67, and she had spent the last 2 years of her life looking for me. The report said she found me 8 months before she died. It said she had contacted a law firm in Burlington. It said she had made arrangements. The report, commissioned by my fiancé's family, assembled without my knowledge, delivered to me at my own rehearsal dinner as a warning, had not been intended to help me. They wanted to know if I had hidden assets, if I had connections they hadn't accounted for. if there was something they could use. They hadn't expected the answer to be yes. I sat in that parking garage for 40 minutes. Then I drove home, packed a bag, and booked a train ticket to Burlington, Vermont, leaving at 6:15 the following morning. I did not call my fiancé. I did not respond to the 17 messages that arrived between midnight and 5 a.m. I turned my phone off somewhere around Hartford and watched the Connecticut hills give way to Massachusetts and then to Vermont, and thought about a woman I had never met who had spent 2 years looking for me. The law firm was on a quiet street 2 blocks from the waterfront. A woman named Delia handled my case. Patient, precise, the kind of person who had clearly delivered difficult news many times and learned how to do it without making it worse. She verified my identity with 3 forms of documentation, offered me coffee I didn't drink, and then placed a single manila envelope on the table between us. "Your aunt retained us in the spring of the year before she passed," Delia said. "She was very specific about her wishes. She wanted to find you before she died. When she wasn't able to make contact directly, she left instructions for us to continue trying." "Why couldn't she make contact?" Delia was quiet for a moment. "She tried. She sent letters to your last known address. She hired a locator service. She reached out through your mother's former employer." She paused. "She was told you weren't interested in being found." The air in the room changed. "I never received any letters," I said. "We know that now." I thought about my fiancé's family, about the attorney who had been calling weekly for months, about how seamlessly my mail had been forwarded since I moved into that apartment, the apartment his mother had helped me find. "What did she leave me?" I asked. Delia opened the envelope. The property was called Marchand Farm, 48 acres, in Hartwick, Vermont, including a working farmhouse, 2 outbuildings, an apple orchard that a local co-op had been leasing for 11 years, and a converted barn that my aunt had in her final years, operated as a small artist residency. The land had been in the family for 4 generations. Its assessed value was listed at $2.3 million. A separate investment account, maintained in trust, held $890,000. There was also a letter. My name was written on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. Careful, slightly old-fashioned, the cursive of someone who had learned penmanship in an era when it was still taught as a discipline. Delia said I could open it there or take it with me. I took it with me. Hartwick was 2 hours north, and it snowed the entire drive. Not a heavy snow, just the thin, persistent kind that makes everything look patient. I found the farm at the end of a gravel road marked with a hand-lettered sign that said March Hand in faded black paint on white wood. The farmhouse was dark, but a caretaker named Tobias had been notified I was coming and met me at the door. He was in his 70s, wind-worn, quiet, and he shook my hand with both of his and said simply, "She talked about you." That was the moment I almost fell apart. Tobias had worked the land for my aunt for 22 years. He showed me through the house without narrating it, just opened doors and let me look. It was full of light, even in winter, because she had put windows everywhere. The kitchen had a long wooden table with 8 chairs. The living room bookshelves went to the ceiling and were filled with the kind of books that get reread. Every room had a plant. Most of them were still alive. She had lived well here. That was the first thing I felt, not envy, not grief, but something like relief. Whatever had happened to separate my mother from this family, it had not made my aunt small. She had built a real life, a generous one. I sat in the kitchen after Tobias left, with the letter in my hands. She had written 4 pages. The handwriting stayed careful throughout, even though I could tell, from the way certain letters faltered, the pressure shifting, that she had written it sick, and that she had known it. She wrote that she and my mother had been close as children, close in the specific way of sisters who are only 2 years apart, who share a bedroom and a language and a way of seeing. She wrote that something happened when they were young adults, a falling out that started with their grandfather's estate and calcified into a silence that neither of them knew how to break. She wrote that she had spent decades being too proud, and then too afraid, and then too late, and that she was sorry for all three. She wrote that she had found out about me through a mutual acquaintance years after my mother died, that she had wept for 2 days, that she had hired someone to find me almost immediately. Then she wrote something that took me 3 readings to fully absorb. She wrote that the property I was inheriting was not, strictly speaking, only hers to give. The farm had come from their grandfather, but their grandfather had left it in trust, not to one sister, but to both, with the understanding that it would pass to the next generation of either line. My mother had walked away from the family and from the property, and everyone had assumed that meant I had no claim. The trust documents, however, were more specific than anyone had revisited in 30 years. My aunt had found this out when she got sick and began putting her own affairs in order. She had contacted her attorney. She had learned that I was not simply her beneficiary. I was, under the terms of the original trust, a co-heir and had been since my mother died. This meant that for 7 years, since my mother's death, a portion of the income generated by this property had been accumulating in an account that belonged to me. The apple orchard lease, the artist residency revenue, the investment returns on the trust principal. The total, Delia had told me, including interest, was just under $340,000. The letter ended, "I am sorry I couldn't find you sooner. I hope this place feels like somewhere you can land. It was built by people who loved each other, and I believe it can be again." Cecily. I sat with that letter for a long time. Outside, the snow had softened the farm into something almost unbearably quiet. The apple trees in the orchard were bare and gray, but there were hundreds of them, and I could see in their shape, the way they'd been pruned, the spacing, the care, that someone had tended them for a very long time. I called the law firm the next morning and told Delia I had questions. She said she had answers. We spent 3 hours on the phone working through the documents, the timeline, the accounts. I called a locksmith and had the locks changed because the attorney had advised it as a precaution during any estate transition. Then I called my fiancé, not because I owed him an explanation. I had stopped thinking in terms of what I owed him somewhere around the Vermont border. I called him because I wanted to hear just once, clearly, whether he had known what his family was doing, whether he had known what his family was doing, whether he had been part of it. He answered on the second ring. He said, "I was going to explain everything." "Tell me about the mail," I said. A long silence. "The letters from Vermont?" I said. "Did you know about them?" My mother thought it would complicate things. 3 seconds of silence. Then I said, "I'm not coming back. The wedding is off. You'll receive formal notice from my attorney." He started to speak. I ended the call. There is a particular kind of grief that isn't about love. It's about the version of your life you had assembled in your mind. All the assumptions and plans and small domestic certainties that turn out to have been built on a foundation someone else had quietly been undermining. That grief is real. I sat with it in my aunt's kitchen, at my aunt's table, in a house that was now mine, and I let it be what it was. Then I made coffee and went outside to walk the orchard in the snow. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were mine in a way that nothing had felt mine for a long time. I stayed at the farm. I wasn't sure I intended to at first. I had a job in the city, an apartment lease, a life I technically still had to dismantle. But Tobias came by each morning and was simply useful, and the caretaker's rhythm of the place, the way small things needed doing every day, turned out to be exactly the kind of structure I needed. I learned that the artist residency had a waiting list. I learned that the co-op's lease on the orchard was up for renewal in March. I learned that my aunt had been in the process of expanding the residency into the second outbuilding before she got sick, and that the permits were already filed. I hired a local contractor named Bev, 50s, steel-toed boots, 0 patience for people who didn't read contracts before signing them, to finish the expansion. I went back to the city twice to handle my apartment and my notice at work. Each time I drove north again, I felt something in my chest ease, like a knot releasing one thread at a time. My fiancé's family filed a nuisance claim in the fall, alleging I had misrepresented my financial position during our relationship. It was the kind of legal action designed not to win but to cost, to drain time and money and energy, to make me negotiate. Their attorney sent a settlement letter in December offering me a sum of money in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement about the circumstances surrounding the end of the engagement. I did not sign. My attorney, a woman in Burlington named Thea who came recommended by Delia and who had the specific energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed this kind of fight, filed a counter-response that laid out, in precise legal language, the timeline of intercepted correspondence, the manner in which the private investigator's report had been obtained and used, and the documented attempts to interfere with my aunt's efforts to find me. The nuisance claim was withdrawn 6 weeks later. I heard through a mutual friend that the family had not taken this well. I wrote that information down in a notebook I kept for exactly this kind of thing. Not out of bitterness, but because it seemed like the kind of detail that deserved to be recorded. And then I went outside and checked on the apple trees, which Tobias had assured me would look better in spring. He was right. They did. I want to tell you something about the artist residency, because it matters. My aunt had started it on a modest basis. 3 or 4 artists at a time, 2-week stays, a small stipend, and a studio space in the barn. The work people made there was quiet and serious and occasionally stunning. I found some of it hanging in the farmhouse. I found her correspondence with former residents in a filing cabinet in the study. Dozens of letters, many of them saying variations of the same thing. This place gave me back something I didn't know I'd lost. I understood that. By the following spring, I had hired a program director, a woman named Saul who had run a smaller residency in Maine and knew the landscape, and we opened the expanded building in June with 6 studios and a shared kitchen and a reading room with the kind of deep chairs you don't want to get out of. We had 18 applications for our first extended session. We accepted 7. Tobias retired formally in August but still came by 3 mornings a week because, he said, the apple trees knew him and it would be rude to just stop. I never went back to city planning. I thought I'd find some version of my old career that made sense from a distance. But what I found instead was that running this place was its own kind of planning, just at a different scale. Land, time, people who needed a quiet corner to make something real. It turned out I was good at that too. My fiancé got engaged to someone else within the year. I found out, the way you find out these things, sideways, through a screen, by accident. I sat with that for an evening and then let it go. Some things you grieve not because they were good, but because they were familiar, and familiarity has its own kind of weight. The farm was not familiar, it was entirely new, and somehow exactly right. There is a photograph in the study. I found it tucked into a book of plant illustrations, which is exactly where someone like my aunt would keep a photograph. 2 girls on a porch. The older one has a gap-toothed smile and bare feet and her arm around the younger one's shoulders with the casual confidence of someone who has never considered that she might have to let go. The younger one is squinting into the sun. She looks like me enough that when I first found it, I had to sit down. That's my mother. And the older girl, with her arm around her, is Cecily. I had it framed and hung it in the kitchen, above the long wooden table with the 8 chairs. Some mornings I have coffee at that table alone before anyone else is up and I look at it. I think about the silence between them, how long it lasted, how unnecessary it probably was, how much it cost both of them. I think about the letters that were sent and intercepted. I think about the version of my life in which none of this was ever found. Then I think about page 7 of a private investigator's report, slid across a table at a restaurant that folded napkins into swans. The worst night of my life, handed to me by people who meant it as a weapon. The way information can be intended as one thing and land as another entirely. My fiancé's family wanted to show me that I was less than I appeared. What they showed me instead was that I was more. That I had roots I hadn't known about. A history I hadn't been allowed to inherit. And a woman who had spent her last years trying to find me and make something right. I think about Cecily a lot. I think about what she would make of the residency, of Soul and the artists, of the orchard in full bloom in late April when the whole farm smells like something you can't name exactly, but that makes you stop walking and just breathe. I think she would find it sufficient. I think she would pour herself a glass of water, pull up a chair at the long table, and tell me something true. I'm learning to leave the chair next to mine empty, just in case. The farm is mine. The orchard is mine. The residency is mine. The work is mine. And for the first time in my adult life, I am nobody's compromise and nobody's secret and nobody's managed inconvenience. I am exactly where someone spent years trying to make sure I could be. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's where I live now. I've thought a lot about the moment my fiancé's brother slid that folder across the table. He did it quietly, efficiently. The way you'd hand someone a bill they'd been ignoring. And I think about what he believed would happen next. That I'd freeze, or crumble, or scramble to explain myself. That I'd become small enough to manage. What he didn't understand, and what I didn't fully understand until much later, is that the damage people try to do to you doesn't always land the way they intended. Sometimes it misses. Sometimes it hits something buried inside you that needed to be found. I used to think resilience was about endurance, about gritting your teeth and surviving the thing that's trying to break you. But sitting at that long wooden table in Cecily's kitchen, reading her letter for the third time in the thin Vermont winter light, I understood it differently. Resilience isn't about surviving the hit. It's about what you do with the information the hit reveals. My fiancé's family handed me a report they meant as a weapon. What they actually handed me was a map. That's the thing about people who operate through control. They assume the world is zero-sum, that your gain is their loss, that information is only useful as leverage, that other people are pieces to be moved. They didn't contact Cecily's law firm to help me. They did it to size me up, and in doing so, they uncovered something they couldn't contain, couldn't intercept, couldn't fold into a clause. I think about Cecily, who spent 2 years and real money trying to reach a niece she'd never met because she believed it was the right thing to do. She didn't know if I'd care. She didn't know if I'd come. She did it anyway, in failing health, because she had lived long enough to understand the cost of letting pride stand longer than it deserves to. That's not a small thing. That's a person who chose integrity when it would have been easier and more comfortable to let it go. And Tobias, who shook my hand with both of his and said she talked about you. A man who showed up every morning for 22 years because he believed the work mattered and the land deserved that kind of attention. There's a kind of intelligence in that, a knowledge that most things worth having require the same quiet, consistent effort, day after day, without applause. What I learned from all of it, from the rehearsal dinner and the report and the farm and the letters and the orchard in spring, is that your integrity is not what you perform for an audience. It's the choices you make when no one is keeping score. Cecily made those choices for years in near total anonymity. My fiancé's family made theirs too, and those choices revealed exactly who they were the moment the stakes got real. I'm not the same person I was walking out of that restaurant. I'm quieter in some ways. More deliberate. I ask better questions before I trust, and I've stopped mistaking someone's confidence for their character. But I haven't become closed. That's the part I'm most careful about, staying open. Because Cecily found me, and Tobias stayed, and Delia told me the truth straight, and Sol said yes to running the residency without hesitating for more than a day. The world is full of people who will hand you something meant to diminish you. It is also full of people like Cecily, who spend their last years trying to make sure you have somewhere to land. I know which kind I want to be.